Does everybody hear me? Okay, good. Welcome to the Sunday seminar. My name is Celia Chapman and I'm on the seminar committee. And I'm so pleased to be able to introduce Daniel Webster. He grew up in a storytelling family in East Tennessee. He was a church pastor for over 40 years in the Christian church, also known as Disciples of Christ, serving congregations in farm country, small cities, large urban areas, and suburban churches. As a pastor, he developed a storytelling style he utilized frequently in his preaching. Over the years, Daniel has led numerous storytelling workshops, primarily for preachers and Christian educators. In some ways, this seminar is a mini storytelling workshop utilizing some of his own personal stories, mostly related to the Christmas season. And you get to participate and you don't even have to be a pastor. So the title of today's seminar is Stories Matter, Especially Yours. In this seminar, we will consider how our stories help shape our lives and may shape the lives of others. Daniel will tell some stories to help us move to a deeper understanding of what these kinds of stories can do. You are invited to think of your own stories around this season that shape who you are. My pleasure to introduce, everybody knows, Daniel Webster.
Thank you. Thanks, Celia. Everything begins with a story. In the beginning is the way the Bible starts. In the beginning is the way the Gospel of John starts. Stories are what help us understand who and what we are. But today I want us to at least start with the idea of what is a story? Donald Davis, who is my favorite storyteller out on the circuit these days, starts with these words. A story is a picture in my mind I want you to see. A picture in my mind I want you to see. Now, Davis goes on to say, I don't mean like a photograph. I don't mean like a photorealism painting, exact and perfect in every way, much more like think of an impressionist painting, where you look and you know what it is, but you see the nuances of the artist, or in this case, the storyteller. Take that whole idea of a story being a picture and alter it just a little bit. A story is a movie or a video in my mind I want you to see. Now, how does that happen? How do I get you to see what's in my mind? Well, words, I'm a preacher. Words are my toolbox, and I'm also a Webster. Words are my toolbox. So allow me to tell you a brief anecdote, not quite a story yet, but an anecdote that I think might help you catch what I'm talking about. I was a little kid. I was in my grandparents' living room. My grandfather had an easy chair that he sat by the fire. Across the room was his television. The fire was right beside the chair, and behind it, although I had been around 3 or 4 or 5 years as a little kid, there was a curtain that I had never looked behind before. And on one day, my grandfather was sitting there smoking his L&M cigarette. And I was talking to him, and I wandered over and I wound up in front of that curtain. And for the first time ever, I thought, well, let me look and see what's behind it. And there's this big box. And I looked at it and I fiddled with it, and I realized the top would open and there were dials, and I suddenly realized it was a giant radio. Remember those radios? Had one big speaker down at the bottom that could really boom. And I said, Granddaddy, there's a big radio back here. And he said, oh, I know. He said, We used to sit here in this living room when your mom and your uncles were your age, and we would watch stories all evening long. Granddaddy, you don't watch the radio, you watch the TV. And my granddaddy looked at me and said, I've seen way more shows and stories on that radio than I ever have on that television. How does that happen? Well, that's not the same one. It was one I found in stock. I wish that radio still existed in my family.
That's beautiful. That radio is beautiful. I think.
It's nice. So how does that happen? We watch stories on the radio. We watch stories in the telling of them if they're told well, but it turns out you can see stories. And in fact, with a really, really, really good storyteller, you can taste stories or smell stories or feel stories. You ever heard a really good ghost story? That you felt scared? Yeah. The biggest part of my growing up years was spent around my grandparents' dining table. The granddaddy I just mentioned, my nanny, my mother's mother, and my holidays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and Easter, were spent around tables with the awesome smells and tastes of good country Southern cooking. It was an awesome way to grow up. Both sets of my grandparents, my mom, my dad, my sisters, my uncles. Later came their wives, aunts, cousins, often family friends experiencing their first Thanksgiving, Christmas, or Easter alone. My nanny declared, no one newly on their own should ever have to eat alone on a holiday. And it turned out if you were ever invited to that table, you were invited forever. So there were always people at the table. The numbers fluctuated through the years, divorces, marriages, moving away, a friend, a death. A bunch of people overfilled with good food, sitting around the table and telling stories. What makes a story a story? I'm going to play with this a little bit. What makes a story a story? We start out with normal. Whatever is normal for you, whatever is normal for the time you were remembering that you might want to tell about, it's normal. Now, normal may be, I grew up in this kind of normal. Upper middle class, educated family, living mostly in the suburbs. I went to school, I made decent grades. My parents were good folks, and I was generally considered a nice boy. That was my normal. Notice I said general. My best friend in elementary school lived a very different type of normal. Abusive, alcoholic dad, long divorced from his mom, and whenever he showed up, it was not pleasant. He lived with his mother, his grandmother, and his older sister. And when his dad made one of those rare appearances, it took the family a while to recover. That was his normal. So don't hear normal as being like my life. Hear normal as being like the life of the person we are talking about, our own life, something back. So we start with normal, and then we move to a crisis. By the way, I'm taking all of this from the writings of the guy I mentioned earlier, Donald Davis. Crisis here does not have to mean something horrible. You know, in my life, most of the time, if I think about a crisis, it means somebody's sick or in the hospital, or I've developed a problem, or somebody stole my seminar just before I walked in the door. which has happened to me. What makes a story? A story, we start with normal and we move to crisis. Crisis, again, does not have to mean something horrible. My friend's crisis was meeting my father. My friend's crisis was meeting my father, who included him on father and son outings with us. He treated him with care and respect, and that rocked my buddy's normal. We start with normal, we move to a crisis, and after that crisis, there's a shift. We adjust, and there's a new normal. And so a story begins with normal, generally. A story begins with normal, has a crisis, and then a lesson learned, and a new way of living and dealing. And that becomes the basis of the next story. In my friend's case, his new normal was being a part of our family. And then we moved, and he didn't. And that was the next crisis for him. And there would become some new normal after that. So that is sort of what makes up a story. As you think about telling, an anecdote is just telling a quick hit of something that happened, something you saw. I went to the park this morning in the dark and I saw an owl. That's an anecdote. It's really cool, but it's an anecdote. It's not a story. A story has something like this kind of flow to it generally. Yeah, Kitty.
When people talk about, especially relating to the pandemic, they say, we have this, now we're gonna have a new normal. Is this what you mean?
In a way, we can talk about, here at UCG, we can talk about the way things were forever. And then we had a pandemic, and suddenly we're learning how to Zoom and do all sorts of different things and wear masks in meetings and gatherings like this. But we're shifting towards something new and we are adjusting. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of stories told about this pandemic. Probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 15 just in this room. I'm going to stick with my grandparents for a little bit because my family was a storytelling family around the table. And my granddaddy, that same guy smoking the L&M cigarette and telling me he watched stories on the radio. When he was 9 years old, his daddy died, leaving him as the oldest of 9 living children. He tried for 2 years to help his mama keep the South Georgia farm going. He wasn't big enough or strong enough. And so on a lark, he found a matchbook when he was in the little general store in town. And on that matchbook was an advertisement for a school where one could learn to use the telegraph. My granddaddy, 11 years old, went to telegrapher school. There's a picture of him in his class. There are 3 women, grown women, 12 men, and a little boy in that picture. That's my grandfather. He was able to keep the farm, able to send brothers and sisters to school. He had the 2nd car in the state of Georgia. He married a woman who went to normal school and was a teacher. His first date with her was to the Scopes monkey trial. My grandfather and grandmother were interesting people. For years, we had a picture of her in her basketball skirt, playing basketball with a basketball that had those sewn seams like you have on a football today. She played for the team. My mama had been a teacher until I came along. Daddy was an engineer who had been on the island of Bikini preparing for the atomic bomb blast, long before anybody had ever called a bathing suit by the name of Bikini. Daddy's parents were mountain people, and I've talked about them before, if any of you remember the story White Bear. So my family was interesting. My mother's youngest brother was of the family, the boring one. He was working on a PhD in transportation. But I had another uncle, my mother's first younger brother, my Uncle Leon. My Uncle Leon was a news reporter. And I want to tell you a little bit about his story. You're not supposed to have favorite uncles, but I did. Leon was my favorite uncle. Leon was my favorite uncle for all kinds of reasons, but one of those was he was just fun to be around, and he always at Christmas time got me the best Christmas presents that I never thought to ask for. He would get me the coolest stuff, and around the table he had stories. Oh, he had stories. He would sit at the table and tell about being in Mississippi covering civil rights. He would talk about how some of you will remember the name Bull Connor. Told him he better be out of Montgomery before sundown the next day or he wouldn't wake up to the sunrise. He covered a young boxer he told me about. He said, Danny, I was Danny. Danny, you need to watch out for this Cassius Clay fella. He's something else before he became Muhammad Ali. My family had a tradition. On Christmas Eve, we always went to church. It's kind of boring, same service year after year after year. We went to church. Then we went to my grandparents where we opened family presents. So my grandparents' presents to us, my uncle's presents, those sorts of things. We would always go there and we would have a dinner after worship. I remember it. I loved it. It was wonderful. But this particular year, I was probably 8 or 9 years old. And the word was that Uncle Leon was reporting a new story and he would be gone for 18 months. I hated it. No presents from Leon and no presents of Leon. My favorite uncle was in some weird place called Vietnam. Well, we had our dinner and we're sitting around and I could tell my nanny's eyes were glistening quite a bit and my mom choked up from time to time. And it just was not a typical fun Christmas Eve. It was kind of just sad. And people were talking and my sister and I were bored and we started looking around and we went into the living room or into the dining room, and there on the dining table were those little angels. Noel. Nanny, what does Noel mean? Oh, it means something about Christmas. Okay. And we fooled around a little bit and we played around and we fooled around and we played around. And, you know, if you play around with things long enough while grown-ups are sad in another room, this is what happens. My sister and I discovered that you changed the words and Leon. And so we went running into my parents. We went and talked to my daddy. Daddy, when you take the pictures tomorrow, would you take one of Leon and would you send it to Vietnam, wherever that is? And Daddy promised that he would. And so we played around, but it was time to go. And so we shifted it back. And I looked out the window and realized it was snowing. Daddy, it's snowing. We got to get to the other side of town. And my dad says, yeah, we probably ought to go. And everybody said, yeah, we ought to go. And nobody got up. They're still talking. And I would hear words like worried and war and scared. And then finally, Daddy said it again. We probably ought to go. Finally, Mama said, you know, we probably ought to go. And just at that moment, I heard a knock at the door. Daddy got up, went over, and he opened the door, and there, grinning like a Cheshire cat, was my Uncle Leon. He had bummed military transports from Vietnam to Europe to the United States, all the way to Knoxville, and had hitchhiked to a couple of blocks away. And there he was. My sister and I were so excited. We loved, we hugged, but Dad says, we really need to go. The snow's coming down, and we headed out to the car. And just suddenly my sister grabbed my hand and said, wait a minute, we got to go. And we ran back in and we showed Leon the words. He laughed and thought it was funny. And then we shifted it back to Noel. The next morning we got up, we opened all our presents, we got ready, and we came back to my grandparents' house for lunch. My other grandparents were there, other relatives. There were about 20 of us gathered around this big table plus a children's table, and we're all talking and talking and talking. And suddenly my grandpa looked up and he said, I think you got it wrong. My nanny had changed it for the lunch. And my nanny looked at my grandfather and said, oh, I didn't get it wrong. And every year for the next 15 years, that's how it read. That's my uncle in Vietnam, a reporter for United Press International. And at our house, we changed the words around. We have a little set of Noel candles. I got married, told Nell the story, and she said, well, I got one too. And for those of you who don't know, my wife's name is Nell. Oh, Nell. Could you see part of that? Could you see some of the story? Nod your head and pretend like you did, even if you didn't. When we tell a story, you have to leave people enough imagination to fill in the blanks. I told you a lot, but you don't really know exactly how the living room looked, exactly what the dining table looked like, or all the different people around the table. You just know there were a bunch. But if I told it well, you kind of saw it. Leave people, when you're telling a story, enough imagination to fill in the blanks. But don't too quickly fall into the old adage, well, to make a long story short, I want to make a story full enough to see or hear or feel. So quit with a make a long story short. You want to tell enough that it transports. When I was a kid, we used to go to church I am the guy that if there is a street evangelist nearby, I can be walking with 10 people and that evangelist picks me out. I can be with my parents, I can be with Nell, I can be with a bunch of friends. That evangelist looks at me and decides, this guy needs what I got to give. So I've been asked probably more than most people, are you saved? If you die tonight, do you know where you're going? Even as a kid, we used to be driving to church every Sunday, and there was a guy who had a bicycle and a big sign and a bullhorn. And he would be on the street with a big sign that says, Acts 2:38 or hell. 40 cars could pass by and he would focus on that one. And he would look at me and point at the sign. So I told that's an anecdote. I told that in a sermon one Sunday. And when I walked out, a guy in the church had sketched out the picture of the fella with the big Acts 2:38 or hell sign. Now, what I didn't tell you about the original story was this was an African-American gentleman who was dressed in a suit and looking fine with that bullhorn and that sign and a big bicycle. My friend drew the sign, drew a white homeless man and a bicycle. And he gave it to me at the door, and I said, "You captured it exactly." Because it didn't matter. You tell enough that people can see the story and fill in the blanks, and it still works. So know that you don't tell everything, but you tell enough. The power of stories is that they're telling us that life adds up somehow. I'm trying to keep it. My senior year of high school, on Christmas Eve, two of my classmates, also my friends, died. You hear that and you might go, there was an automobile accident. No, one simply died of a brain hemorrhage with no apparent reason, headaches, went to the hospital for the headaches, and with a room full of my friends around him, he had a seizure and he was gone. The other one died of leukemia, both Christmas Eve. That sort of train wrecks a whole classroom's faith. Where is God? Who is God? Why is God? What was going on here? What? And so that was part of my mind the next year. When I graduated that spring, my best friend, I had two best friends, we did everything together. We suddenly headed off in three different directions. I went to a little school in Kentucky called, I swear this is true, I went to Transylvania. I did. My other friend went to North Carolina to Black Mountain, where he became a new best friend with Franklin Graham. Didn't mean to say it that way. And the other one joined the Navy. Chogi joined the Navy. He went off, he went through camp, and then he started training to be on a submarine. Chogi training to be on a submarine, in my mind, was about as hysterical as anything I could think of. Him being in the military was about as hysterical as anything I could think of. I just didn't see him as military material. But there he was. The fall semester went by. And then it became time to come home for Christmas break, and I was home, but I wasn't very excited about it. I still had in my mind what had happened on Christmas Eve the year before. It was sort of stuck in me, and I was having a real hard time. On Christmas Eve morning, the phone rang. It was Chogi calling from San Diego. I got last second leave. I'm on standby on 3 flights from San Diego to get to Knoxville. I may not make it, but if I do, could you pick me up at the airport tonight and take me to my parents' church for the Christmas Eve service? Sure. So I went and told Mom, I need the car for after we go to Nanny and Granddaddy's for dinner tonight. And she said, why do you need the car? And I told her, I said, well, Chogi thinks he's going to get home and we're going to surprise his parents. She said, well, I was sorority sisters with his mom. We're going to make sure he gets home. I'm going to make sure he gets home. Well, we're going to pray, she said. So that night at church, she told everybody in the church, Danny's best friend is trying to get home on military leave, and we got to pray he gets home so he can spend Christmas with his family. Then we got to my grandparents and my aunts and uncles collected from all over the place. And she said, Danny's friend Chogi's coming in tonight. And everybody said, Chogi. And we prayed around the dinner table for Chogi to come. And Chogi was supposed to land at 10:30. And Mama said to me at 9 o'clock, you need to go. He's going to get there early. And so I went. An hour and 15 minutes before his flight was to land, I was there. Back then, you could go all the way to the gate. And so I was at the gate, and here came people, one after another, after another, after another, after another. And I thought, he didn't make it. Been one of the flights. And then third from the last, I saw a guy in a sailor hat bopping along. Chogi, you made it. Bad bro hugs. And then we got to talking, and he said, I was the last person on 2 of the flights. I was so lucky. I said, you weren't lucky. What do you mean? My mama was praying. Huh? Trust me. You got on those flights because of my mama and my church and my family. So we went to his church. I got there. I slung his duffel bag over my shoulder, and we started walking in. And I set it back in the narthex, just got it out of the way. And I wanted to see what happened. And he walked down the aisle and got to the aisle where his family was, and his mother burst into tears. And then I looked, and his father was just laughing, but tears were running down his face. And I saw his brother and Drew look back at me and I'm thinking, I did what I was supposed to do. Now let me get out of here. And I got to the back, and a deadgum grusher stuck a folding chair under me and told me to sit down. The service was going. And now I've already been to my church, and it wasn't much fun. And I am here at this church, and I am going, how can I get out of here? And then something almost magical happened. The choir sang like angels. And I thought, well, maybe I'll stay. And then a sermon that actually was different and made sense. And I thought, I need to switch churches. And then they invited everybody forward for communion, and I had communion in a church I'd never been in before. And I thought, this is awesome. And when I got back to my seat, all of a sudden the lights went out except for 4 Advent candles, except I'd never heard of Advent. And then at exactly the stroke of midnight, the chime rang. And from the Advent candles was lit the Christ candle, and that light was passed among us in the congregation. And I thought, okay, I get it. This Christmas Eve is way better than last year. And as I went out to the car, I thought to myself, the hoped-for son came tonight. The hoped-for son arrived. Now, was I talking about Jesus, or was I talking about Chogi?
Early on.
Yes. Yes. I was talking about both. I don't know what you saw. Your story could be the key that unlocks someone else's prison. Don't be afraid to share it. This guy right here is really amazing at helping people tell the stories that unlock prisons. Self-narrate is an awesome group. I hope I'm not stepping. But self-narrate helps people to unlock their own prisons, and in the sharing of their stories, unlock the prisons of their listeners from time to time. So I want you to think about it a minute. What crisis have you experienced that led you to a new normal, that in the telling of it might bring new strength both to you and to someone else? What if you're moving through a crisis to a new normal might give another person hope? After all, it is the first day of Advent, hope. So I want to hit this real quick. Everyone has a story that'll break your heart. And if you're really paying attention, most people have a story that will bring you to your knees. That's Brene Brown, and the E on the end of Brene should have a over it, but I couldn't figure out how to do that on the typewriter. But you have to hear that story first. Somebody's got a story that'll break your heart or bring you to your knees. It doesn't do any good if it's not told and heard. I told a story. It might have even been one of the ones I told this morning to you, but I told a story sermon in my church in Illinois. And afterwards, an older gentleman stopped by me and put his hand on my shoulder, and he said, "You sure have lived an exciting and interesting life." I thought, no, I really haven't, but I have led a life where I do try to remember and be introspective about the things I've experienced. And if you find that interesting, we should talk. And so that week I went to his house, and we sat and had coffee at breakfast. If any of y'all are going to second service,
5-minute warning.
you get the 5-minute warning. So he and I were talking over coffee, and I just looked around and I said, "Tell me about that picture of your family over there." And he told me how he met his wife and how he had been in the war, how he had gotten injured and earned a Purple Heart, and how he had wound up in the hospital for months, and his wife had written him every day. They weren't married yet, but she had written him every day. And he told me the story of their love. And then I said, "Well, what's that over there?" And then he mentioned, "Well, yeah, I got another kind of medal as well for valor and heroism." But he said, but. So he tells me this. He tells me one story after another, one thing after another, one thing after another. And when we finally got to the end of the morning, I looked at him and said, "Wow, you've lived an interesting life." And he looked at me and he laughed and he said, "I guess I have. I just needed to tell it to remember. I just needed to tell it to remember." He died a couple of months later. And I had stories to tell in his memorial service because he had told me his. We don't need just to tell stories, we need to hear them too. It's human to be told stories. The more we're governed by idiots and have no control over our destinies, the more we need to tell stories to each other about who we are, why we are, where we come from, and what might be possible. It's because we fail to listen to other stories We're becoming a fragmented, torn human race. I'm a Webster. I'm a word guy. Fragmented means torn apart, dismembered. Stories help us remember. Yes, remember as to help us recall, but remember as to bring us back together. I think of Jesus using that word when he was gathered with his disciples around the table, remembering an old story called Passover. It helped them recall who and whose they were, and then he added a mnemonic practice as he retold the story. And with bread and cup, he said, when you do this, remember me. Come back together. Think about the UCG stories that tell us who we are. Every once in a while, I hear another one that adds to my understanding of what this church is and is about. Now think about all the new members and friends of the church who don't know those stories. Where, how, when might we find ways to tell them? How might we remember? Now, I want to tell you this. When it comes to stories, remember normal, crisis, new normal, but also know that it takes practice over time, telling your story, becoming comfortable with telling stories at all to get there. You're not good at it right off the bat. This is me when I started. Just so you know, if I'm any good now, I wasn't when I started. It took a while. Oh. Okay, I got a couple of people who know what this is about. Are you experienced at telling stories? Chances are you've been doing it much of your life. You just weren't thinking about it in quite that way. So I would encourage you to think back to your childhood over the next few weeks. Remember some stories, some smells, some tastes, some times with grandparents, whatever your normal was, and then how things shifted. You might hit the smell of evergreen and it'll trigger something, or cookies baking, or turkey, or L&M cigarette smoke, a fire. It might be an image, or it might be a shoot your eye out official Red Ryder carbon action 200 shot range model air rifle with compass in the stock and a thing that tells time, or a new bike, whatever. Think about that and who was there. How did you recall that story? Why did you recall that story? And then tell somebody. Tell somebody. Is it a story yet? Or is it an anecdote that could become a story? What was normal before? What crisis came that changed things? What was different after? As you go home, think about telling some of these stories and remember who you were, who you've become, and who you are in the telling of them to others. I thank you for listening, and I am open to questions if you have any. And open to going home if you don't. Yeah, Jeff.
Isn't the process of writing a memoir isn't the process of writing a memoir the telling of your story to yourself in a way?
In a way, yeah. Some memoirs, good memoirs, I think, tell stories. Some people string together a lot of anecdotes and don't give you many stories. You know, I did this, I did that, I remember this, I remember that. Stories have more to them than just the memory of an event that happened, I was there for, or happened to, or because of me. So good memoir has a narrative to it, I think. Yeah, I got a couple. Yes.
You mentioned which story tells is deep and it tells a lot, but it leaves some openings for people's imagination. And that made me wonder about film, because it seems like you're seeing everything. You know, you've got the visual. What's left out?
What's left out in the film?
What's left out for your imagination?
In a film, you got a thought there? I thought you were going to jump in.
You need help?
A film is edited such that it tells you exactly what it wants you to see. It may leave things open for you to fill in the blanks, and you kind of do that automatically, just the way my friend did with the story, seeing the Acts 2:38 or hell, and filled in the blanks. I told him enough to have a picture of it. How he pictured it is different. You're sort of forced a little bit to picture things with a film as you've seen them, and that gives you a different kind of context. It's like when I was a kid. I remember the first time we moved to New York for a year, and I saw a Beetle Bailey television cartoon. Well, I've been reading Beetle Bailey for several years. I knew exactly what he sounded like till I saw that dang cartoon. And it didn't sound anything like I imagined. Films sort of force you to buy in to a certain way of thinking. John, I thought.
So I come from a family, on my mother's side, we get together every 2 years for big family reunion, and it's all stories. One of the things that happens is people remember the stories differently. So you've heard these. And so somebody starts telling the story and then somebody else corrects them, no, or they think they correct them. And I remember I tell some stories and Liz has a different remembrance. And I remember once recently, I just said, look, it's my story, like I'm telling it, and you want to tell it, you tell it. So it's sort of like, let me tell it my way, and then you tell the same story your way.
Guarantee you that's true with every family. If two people were there for the same thing, they remember it different. Some people think, you know, I tell a story sometimes and they'll go, I didn't even think that was worth remembering. And then she kind of looks at me and says, and it wasn't. I go, well, shoot. But yeah, my sister and I used to debate all the time what really happened. And I would argue and say, well, I was older. So anyway, finally I just said, you tell it your way and I'll tell it my way and see what people think.
Related to that, a friend who's even better read than I am last week told me about that every time you remember something, you change it forever. Just one person changes the memory forever every time they look at that memory.
My Chogi story has a longer version and a shorter version and every time I tell it, it's different. I mean, the essentials are the same. Chogi joined the Navy. He came home that first Christmas Eve, and I picked him up, but details shift a little bit in my mind because I'm trying to see it a little bit as the video that I'm describing to you, or the movie I'm trying to describe. Yeah, Tony.
Well, I think in relation to John's comment, in response to it, that thing of truth is a little bit malleable. You know, facts either are or are not true, but truth is more than whether every fact was just right. And I think that's the one thing about a great story is that it goes beyond just the telling of the facts.
Donald Davis, the guy I mentioned before and who talks about the normal crisis and new normal idea, whether that's original to him, I don't know, but that's where I got it. I heard Donald Davis at the National Storytelling Festival in Jonesboro, Tennessee. I actually heard about 20 great storytellers at that. But I came back and we were gathered together with some friends, a woman from my church and another minister and some folks. And we're sitting around drinking wine and we're talking about the various stories we heard. And I was just going on and on about this Donald Davis story I just heard, how wonderful it was. And the woman from my church looked at me and said, "Do you think that's true?" I said, "Absolutely, I think that's true. I think it's just as true as the creation stories in Genesis." She went, "What?" I said, "Well, there's two different stories. I think they both tell truth, but they can't both be accurate." And she said, "Well, I'm a news reporter and I see truth differently than you." And I thought about that in relation to my uncle. And when he wrote a story, it had to be factual, reporter true. When he told one around the dining table, it was a whole different kind of truth. So yeah, I think there's story true and then there's reporter true, if that makes sense.
Just a quote that I like to sort of relate to that on myth, and it was a little girl who said, "What is a myth?" And she said, "It's something that's not true on the outside, it's only true on the inside."
I love it. I love it.
And since I have a mic, that the gospel stories Jesus told, I mean, all of those parables are brief stories that we remember. If he just listed a bunch of facts, I probably would have never remembered them, but you remember the stories.
I told somebody when I asked her, that same woman, one time, who, by the way, her daughter is now a disciple minister and is the better storyteller, one of the best storytellers in the denomination. So must drive her mother crazy. I don't even know where I was going with that. I got lost in the aside. So, yes, Lindsay.
Oh, I might be loud enough. I don't know.
Wait a minute.
Oh, wait, no.
minute.
Oh, I see. I was just gonna say there's an amazing researcher in town. Brandon knows that connection. Dr. Susan Bluck out at UF, who runs the Life Story Lab. And so if you're not familiar, it's amazing. And she's running research where you just go and tell stories. And they are looking at why that is. Why can we tell the same story and walk away with such a different memory or a different experience? What does that mean for our personal development? What's the benefit of sharing stories? It's sort of nerdy, but it's, I think, neat, this neurological and psychological underpinning of stories. And so we have this really cool researcher in town who's trying to quantify that. It's such a neat thing. And her lab is very accessible. It's called the Life Story Lab, if anyone wants to explore that a little bit.
Nice, nice. I'd like to point out one thing. Remember O'Neill? Notice she didn't come? And there's a reason, I'm sure. It's because every time I tell a story, she's going, "It's not the way I remember it. I'm telling it last time." Thank you all. I appreciate it very much. Oh, and just for your awareness, I don't think I'm going to be doing it, but Board of Parish Ministry is in charge of the Sunday after Christmas, and we're going to 3, 4, 5, depending on the length, have people tell Christmas memory stories or other stories. So just so you know, that's coming up on the 26th, the day after Christmas. Blessings and peace. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Thank you. Seminar committee.